Howdy folks. Today we're going to be looking at some additional React topics. We're going to look at the child prop or children prop. We're going to look at a little bit of event handling and maybe some other stuff if we get to it. So let's start with an example. We have our inputs, right? Our labeled inputs. We have 3 inputs. There they are. They're all good. But let's say that I wanted to put these in a form so I could do a form submission with them. Right? We've done that in a number of other projects where you've got a form, you go, okay, I submit this form, I get that data, I cancel the form submission, but I want to hold on to that form submission because it gets submitted in a number of different ways that we want to take advantage of. So now I just get that data back. So what we want to do in that case is let's make a form component. Okay, so form.js. React function form, and then we're just going to return a form tag. Empty for now. We'll fill it later. Now with a form, we kind of want to wrap these labeled inputs in the form, right? Because that's how forms work. They have some inputs, etc. So I'm going to actually bring my form in here, form, and then I'm going to take these out, put them in the form. And then I'm going to toss these inside there. We have to import labeled input. Okay? Cool. So now, if I look at my elements, all these are inside the form. Beautiful. Totally fine. Nested components like this, again, completely legitimate. But here's the problem. I kind of want a generic form component because I've got my name, my age, my date of birth, right? Let's say I want another form for adding a car, okay? So what I could do is I could duplicate this. I could make a new file, car form, put this in here. And I could be like, yeah, make model and year, okay? Car form. Oops. Not bar form. And then I go to my app and I say, yeah, I need, oh God, car form. Okay. Then if I go here, now I've got my main user form and I've got my car form. Totally fine. 2 forms. That's not very generic though, because let's say I put in a bunch of complicated logic on how to handle a form in this component. I have to duplicate that logic over here because this is another form. I don't really want to do that. I would like to avoid that because the whole point of a component is to kind of make generic, like we did with the labeled input. I don't want to have to make a new labeled input or like a new labeled input component for every single label, so I passed a prop. That's what I want to do with my form as well. So I don't want to actually have car form. What I really like to be able to do is see how this form here has these children. I'd like to be able to do that with the form component. So I'd like to actually be able to do something like this. And just pop those in there. Because then what I can do, if I can do that, then I can do the same thing for the car form. I can actually just take these in here. Oops. Put them in here. Okay. And then I don't even need the car form, right? I could just trash that. And I only need that one component, which is good because now I only need one generic form component. So what if I do this? The page is completely blank. And the reason for that is React does not automatically just insert these child elements into the top level element. It wants you to decide what to do with them. So how do we do that? How do we put them in here? Well, there's a special prop called children. And let's console log that so we can see what it is. All right, so if I go here to my console, you can see that each one of these, this is a specific make, right? So that's the make label element. And even says labeled input, make. And this is basically the internal representation of what this element looks like to React. But basically, when I give React some children like this by putting them in between the open tag and closing tag, just like HTML would, they get pushed down as a prop. Children. This is an array of all the children that have been given. So I could add them in here. Children 0. Okay. And let's do the other two. Children 1 and 2. So now if I go here, you can see there they all are again. But now I don't have two separate form elements or components. I have one single form component, and that's just got generic children in it. Okay, well, let's add another field in here. Color. Color doesn't show up. Why doesn't color show up? Well, because we're only showing 3 children. Okay, well, let's put in that third children, or that fourth one. Totally fine. All right, now it's there. But we start to run into a concerning thing here, because what if I want to add another field? Do I have to come back here and add another child, another child, and another child? Well, React doesn't need this. These are individual elements, right? But React, I can actually return the entire child array, because children is an array of React elements. So I can have an array in here, and it works just as well. So if you have an array of children, you can actually just put that child array wherever in your structure. And this is very common in React, especially if you have components like this, which are meant to be more generic components, where they're taking in some children that they don't really know anything about. They don't have to. And they're just putting some structure around them. Very common for that to happen. Okay, so now we've got our form. Well, let's add a button onto that form, right? Because we want to be able to submit that form. Button, submit form. And there we go. And you can see now the power of having that one generic component. I added that button in one place, and it got pushed to both forms. So I could have had 30 forms on here, and they all would have gotten that button. I add a name, age, date of birth, submit, and it reloads the page. Well, we know how to stop that, right? We have to get the event, the form, then we call document the add event listener on submit, and then we cancel the event. Well, how do we do that here? Do we add, what we could do is we could say ID equals, form. And then, well, the problem with that now is we have forms with 2 IDs. So maybe we'll actually pass that in as a property, right? Because we can do that. Pass that in as a property, and then we'll say, okay, ID equals name form. Okay, and then this one, ID equals car form. And you can see now how these are attributes and these are children, but they both show up in the same properties. Okay? All right, now we've got name form and car form. Totally fine. So what we can do is we can actually pull in our use effect. And we can be like, okay, I gotta attach an event listener, so use effect. This should only happen when the component mounts. Document.add event listener ID. No, actually, sorry, it'd be document.get element ID.add event listener. All right, and then we have like event, and we're just gonna say console log. Oh, this is actually this is gonna be submit. Okay, and then we're gonna say console log got this event, and then we're gonna say okay event dot prevent default kosher. All right. So then let's come in here, look at our console. Submit form, got this event. That works. That works pretty well, doesn't it? Now, here's the problem. This is not how we want to do this. React gets unhappy when we bring in native DOM methods into our system. So, there's actually an easier way of doing this. Submit is the event we want. So if I say on submit, I can just do that like this. React does the same event attaching for us. If this is a click, I would say on click. If it was a key event, I could say on key on key down, etc., but I'm saying on submit. So you notice the event name is here. Prevent default log submitted form. All right. Now if I go here and I say submit form, you can see it shows up here and there's that. So that's the event handler added onto here very easily. So now that we've got that in there, we kind of want to get all the data from that form, right? So how do we get that data? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to say data equals new form data e.target. This is just a special way of saying, hey, the data that you were that you would have normally submitted, just put that in here instead. Okay, and let's console log data. Let's check this out. I go in here, put some junk data in here, submit form. Oh, forgot to prevent default. All right, let's try that again. Okay, and it's empty. Why is it empty? Well, if I select one of these elements, you can see it doesn't have a name. Forms require that name. Well, that means I have to come back up here to labeled input and I have to add a name. So let's add name equals age, name equals date of birth. I'm going to ignore these ones for now. And let's go to labeled input. We'll pull a name here, and then we'll say input type name equals name. All right, and then we look back here. Now we've got that specific name equals age, etc. Name equals date of birth. Okay. So we submit that again. Oh, maybe I need to reload. Still nothing. Well, that looks like that. Maybe that's just not going to work too well, is it? And in fact, the reason for that is that's not really how React form handling works. It doesn't really work that way. So we can't just go and grab our data like this. What we need then is we actually need to be able to have these labeled inputs kind of under our control inside the form, because we don't really handle it that way. Instead, when we form submit, we actually need to be tracking all that data ourselves and just kind of saving it appropriately. So what we need to do then is we actually do, unfortunately, need to bring the labeled inputs into our form. But we want to keep that generic, right? So how do we do that? Well, what we can do is we can have our form here, right? And in addition to our ID, we could actually have a fields object, right? And then we can make that an array, right? Or, yeah, and then we could just say, okay, you know, name, age, date of birth, like that. And then what we're going to do is inside our form, we're going to take our fields and we're actually going to loop over them. So rather than children, this is the other way that we can build generic components. We're going to say fields.map field. Why map? Map returns an array. And so this is a very common way. If I actually at this point return labeled input with label equals field, this is going to make an array of labeled inputs and then return it, and that should be totally fine. Oh, I need to I'm actually going to take this one out real quick because this one hasn't been updated yet. Okay. Now you can see again we have this same thing. Nothing has really changed there. So what's the difference? Well, now the difference, this is still generic because I'm passing my fields in like this, so I can still do whatever I want. But now form actually has control over the labeled input. And let me show you why that's valuable. So let's say I put labeled input, right? And I put an on change event, okay? So, well, actually, yeah. So, because I want to actually know when this data changes. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to put a use state in here. And so now and I'll show you why that in a minute. So on change, we'll just say on change. We'll just pass that right in, right? Cool. Now I go here, I type some stuff. Every time I type, it pushes up. I don't think this reset. Up there into that change handler, which isn't doing anything right now. But what I can do now is I can actually keep track of these fields. So I can say, okay, fields, data, field data equals use state, empty array. And now inside here, I can pass in my on change. Okay. New data equals e.target dot value. Now I can say, okay, set field data, and we're going to spread field data because I'm only updating one of them, and set field data requires a new object. Field new data. And then every time this re-renders, let me console log field data. Okay, so now we're here. So you can see as I'm typing here, it adds in that name, age, date of birth. And so it's keeping track of that data on my behalf. That's why it's really valuable to have this labeled input as not just as a passed in child of the form, but a child that the form actually creates itself, because now it can actually add these event handlers onto the system. And now it can get this data here, because now when I submit, put that in here. When I go and submit this, I can say name, age, date of birth, and I click submit. Now I have all this data. So this is how React handles forms and things like this. You're supposed to have, you're supposed to be handling it by keeping track of the data yourself. And so that can be a little difficult in this case. And so that's why instead of using the generic children like that, instead we're just passing in data that tells the form how to build itself. So if we want to do the same thing here, we would say fields equals make model year color. Okay. Save that. And now we have that. And so if I put a bunch of junk in here, I can submit that, and there it is. So there's one thing left that I want to do here, right? So this submission, this form submission, is great. Get my data in there. It tracks all the data. But I kind of want to bubble that up to the app. Well, how do I do that? Similar to how we handled the labeled input. I've got my on submit here. I'm actually just going to put on submit data. And I'll just put that data there. And then I'll pull in on submit. Okay. And then I can just call on submit with field data. Cool. Easy. And so then what that's going to do is if I come up here, have all this stuff in here, and I submit, now it's calling, it's doing the same data, but you notice it's calling from app.js rather than form.js. And what this means now is that I can create a form, give it some fields, and all I have to care about is what to do when that data is submitted. So maybe at that case, I call fetch. I save it to the database, etc., etc. So that is how you handle that. And so we went over a little bit over children. We ended up not being able to use it, unfortunately. But, you know, that's kind of how we handle that stuff. So the children array, as you noticed, is often used when you're adding structure to something, but you're not actually modifying it, or you don't actually need access to its data. And that's because when you pass children in, the parent that you're passing the child into doesn't actually have any access to its variables. I mean, it does, but it's kind of complicated for that, so we don't normally do it. So what we often do instead is we pass in a field that lets the parent create its own children. But children is still a very powerful thing if you're dealing with structure. And then for event handling, it's just very simple. You just say on. It's very rare that you want to attach multiple event handlers to the same object in React. That's just not a thing that we often do. But yeah, it's very easy. It attaches just to this individual element, and you can have your handler. Oftentimes, you'll bubble that event. You'll do some manipulation like we did here. We're not actually taking that event and bubbling it up. We're taking some other data that was preset and bubbling that up. So you can see we've almost got like an event handler, like a pseudo event handler on form that we pass in and we get data back, whereas that actually goes into a real event handler on the form here. Similar with the onChange, which is just a bubbled input. So you can do both. It's very flexible. Anyway, I hope that was helpful, and I'll see you all next time.